Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by G'Ra Asim, a writer and musician who is the assistant professor of creative writing at Washington University in St. Louis. Among other things, he plays the bass, he sings and writes lyrics for his pop punk quintet, Baby Got Back Talk. And of course, he's joining us today as the author of Boyz in the Void, a mixtape to my brother. Of Boyz in the Void, Paul Beatty writes, written with love, your edition, and the utmost respect, Boyz in the Void is a genuine keepsake. And if that wasn't praise enough, the great Kimberly Williams Crenshaw writes, Boyz in the Void is a spellbounding odyssey and a magnificent debut of an exciting young author and thinker. How you doing today, man?
I'm very well. Great to be here, Mark. How are you today?
I'm good. So, this is, a kind of a full circle moment for me because I know your parents, right? And particularly your father, Jabari.
Well, I don't think that mere non-confrontation or avoiding confrontation is going to get the things that Black people and other oppressed people need.
Who more than 20 years ago, gave me my first opportunity to write with the big time when he assigned me a review of Nelson George's Hip Hop America to write in the Washington Post.
Wow.
And even then, getting to know him and what was a tribe, as I understood it even then, and wondering what it means to, be a creative as he is and your mother, Leanna, with these 5 children. And so I want to start with this question for you. Did you imagine yourself, growing up in that space and being the intellect that you are, that you show extraordinarily throughout the book? Did you ever expect to be a college professor? Right. That doesn't seem like that might have been the end game for you.
Yeah. And that's a funny question. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. And as far as the full circle moment, I just want to say stories like that always inspire me because it makes me feel like an heir to a tradition, right? And part of what Boyz in the Void is about is kind of how that tradition that we can locate ourselves in, you, myself, so many others, is not fully legible to the broader world, right? And it's fun to have an engagement with people who are, particularly aware, acutely aware, viscerally aware of that tradition. Yeah. As far as the college professor thing, you're totally spot on. When I was, I want to say much younger, but maybe not too much younger, the idea that I would ever get it together academically and teach people about writing seemed really far-fetched. As the book details, I was somebody who really chafed against public education, or the schooling that I had. I had a lot of authority issues, but it turns out, as you probably know, that those are not the worst qualities for a professor, and particularly a creative writing professor, to have. So I'm blessed in that regard.
You describe your brother, and of course the book is written as a series of letters, a mixtape to your younger brother, G'Ra. And you describe him as an artist in reticence. And I want to talk about that in a moment, but there's a way in which you're a memoirist in reticence. This almost feels like an anti-memoir in the sense that it doesn't seem as though you actually wanted to write a book about yourself.
Yeah, that's a great read. You really picked up on something there. I started writing about punk and straight edge culture in grad school in a much less overtly personal way. Yeah. And there were questions that I wanted to explore that the book obviously eventually got around to exploring. But in my early workshop experiences, the problem I kept running into was that my readers, my classmates, my professors as well, would say that they kind of felt like they were reading a disembodied consciousness. They could not imagine the corporealization of the thinking that was happening on that page, right? And obviously, I detected there were clearly some racist overtones to that failure of imagination. But I decided to do what Paul Beatty calls fold it in, right? Create a conceit for the book, a superstructure for the book, a title for the book that alluded to this situation of being a consciousness that people cannot readily imagine. And so what you're pointing out with G'Ra Asim, the artist in reticence thing, it's like, he's definitely one, but there is a coal talking to the kettle sort of component to that. And there might be that throughout the book. That might actually be one of the themes that many of the things I'm saying about him, observing about him in different ways, right? I'm also exhibiting those traits and kind of a different stratum of life, perhaps.
You know, there are lots of Black male writers who have written about the fear associated with the Black body, right? That's one of our primary narratives, right? We walk into spaces and the spaces change because of who we are. The way that you discuss your experience and then also your brother's experience of the disconnect between what people see and what's on the page, right? That's illegible to folks, right? And unbelievable, right? That, you know, when you talk about your brother's experience with the student newspaper, and there's like, you know, tell us who wrote this, right? Because you couldn't have possibly, because you don't look like you could write this, right? Which is a whole nother kind of level than, you know, Black people can't think, Black people can't write, you know, which is a longer narrative. But it's like, okay, even if I can accept Black people can do that, you don't look like someone who can do that.
Right. And the extra layer to that, I think, is well, I think in general, we anticipate, or we hope at least, that artists who are really expressive in a given medium are somehow going to be equally expressive when we engage them in person. It's a trope, right? That people are disappointed that when you sit down and you talk to, I don't know, Prince about his songs, he might not have as much to say about them as the songs are saying. And I think in Joss's case, there's, like you alluded to, of course, there's already the level at which his physical appearance seems to belie what's on the page, but I think there's also this other layer of his demeanor. And I think when people are fascinated with a Black person who can think, a Black person who can write, it's my experience that they have like this sort of assumption that they should get access to that when they want to, right? That they should be able to snap their fingers. You should perform your intellect for them. And I think the problem Jossie was running into was not just the idea he must have been a plagiarist, but also that if this really was his consciousness on the page, his demeanor, his presence in class, his affect should be more consistent with what he wrote. And that's a concept I'm really interested in and return to throughout the book.
Yeah, I chuckled out loud when you talked about a high school English teacher in the honors class, and y'all had this little tiff back and forth about Invisible Man being a cornerstone of Black literature. And then, of course, you ultimately failing the class. And you know, the teacher saying to you is like, you're not someone who should have got an F, right? So on the one hand, there's this weird kind of expectation that sometimes teachers have for Black students, Black male students, and what outcomes should look like, right? And absolutely their inability to, you know, the outcome that you had in that class was the outcome that you expected to have in that class, right? And what's unbelievable to her is that would have been the outcome that you wanted.
Right. And I mean, of course, she's ultimately right. I was kind of a wantonly self-destructive 17-year-old, but you know, there's that tension where sometimes adults would say, you're not being yourself, right? I have this sense of what your role is. And because you don't cohere with that role, you must be doing something wrong. You must be being artificial, inauthentic. And I think a thing I butt up against throughout the book in different ways is like, I very often produce that response by being myself.
Right.
And I don't know what else I can do.
Have you had a chance at all to talk to that teacher since the book has been published? Because that was the first thing in my head, right?
Well, I would not relish that conversation. I gotta say, I would have it, but it would be uncomfortable. I think.
You describe your brothers as again artists in reticence, this unwillingness to embrace intellectual capability. There were a lot of outlier chuckles I had while reading this book, but the idea of your rather large brother walking around the house and not communicating with your parents, right? Willfully, right? And then when he does, right, as kind of a game, right, knowing that he's kind of pushing their buttons. For you and your brother, and obviously your siblings, what was it like to grow up in a house with a creative? Because I consider myself a creative, but my parents weren't creatives, right? That's a space that I had to create for myself and find, folks to partner with and to be in community with. What was it like for you growing up in a house full of creatives?
When I was quite young, people used to joke. I mean, not to me, but I would overhear it. Your kids, to Liana and Jabari, your kids are going to have to run away and become bankers and lawyers. And there's, that was kind of a prescient joke, and it came up more than a few times. But, sometimes when I think about my education, I think less about time I spent in a classroom and really, the years between ages, I'd say 4 to 9. When I got out of school, I would spend the rest of the day with my mom a lot of the time. And the rest of my time with my mom, she would be running her own theater company in North St. Louis. And for her, that involved writing a script, helping to arrange the score. She wasn't a composer, but she would sing parts of the composer, building a set, directing shows, fundraising, doing the administrative logistical component, like getting tickets made. And I was witness to that. The way our household was structured, it was an expectation that I was supposed to ride shotgun, so to speak, not literally shotgun because we didn't have a car, and not get in the way, right? To be present, but to kind of manage my own behavior so that I was not a disruption while all of this was going on. And the big mistake that I made while I was internalizing everything I watched my mother do is that I thought it was normal. So I actually had to go into the broader world and understand that all the things that I picked up about artistic practice or even about intellectual practice were actually looked at in the world's eyes as aberrant. And that for a lot of folks, somebody like my mom, right, who was a college dropout, who at that time had eventually 3 children, who was happily married, who lived in the ghetto, right? That a person like her is not on most folks' social map or what we might call their social imaginary. And so a lot of the values and a lot of the worldview that I absorbed through those experiences it did not compute for the broader society.
I told your father this once, that I was envious of him. He's one of the most productive writers that I know, right? In fact, he just dropped a novel, right? Like literally since we've been speaking, he dropped a novel. And I could never imagine what it was like to be so productive and have so many kids in the house. It's like, I just had 2, and it was like trying to get work done. Right. And this is that kind of, life of the mind work, right? You need solitude, you need quiet. I mean, all those kinds of things. And the only way you could really pull that off was to pull the kids into that world also.
There you go. I always joke, sometimes people say, growing up, I was distant from my father because he was always working. And my dad was both always working and always around. And that's how he did it, right? I mean, he's at the dinner table, but the laptop's open, the notebook's open. He's sitting in the room while we're watching the game, but he's also reading Dickens and annotating it. And that's a model, like I said, that's a model that you kind of take in without appreciating the fact that it might be at least a little anomalous.
one of the big ideas that comes through in your book, and I'm going to read this quote. To be a Black artist of any consequence, you must not only untether yourself from essentialized notions of Blackness, but create with such a fluency as to move your audience to jettison the same constraints. Unpack that a little bit for our audience.
Sure thing. So that sentence comes up in the chapter, which is called Evidence of Things Unseen, seen spelled SCENE.
Yeah.
And it's dealing with, it's sort of an extended riff on an idea you alluded to that comes up earlier in the book. This English teacher who tells me Invisible Man is the cornerstone of African American. Right? All African American literature proceeds from this exemplar of the tradition. And of course, when I was challenging that, I was trying to say, it's okay to use that book as kind of like a analytical anchor, but it would be a mistake to think that everything Black people create of the diaspora or, just Black people stateside is going to look at Invisible Man as a model, right? We are as expansive in our imaginative and creative capacities as anybody else. And we aren't confined to this one lane just because it's the lane you happen to be familiar with.
Yeah.
That's what they told me in school. And what I'm speaking to in the sentence you read or sentences is this idea that to make a contribution as a Black artist, I think you have to be aware of folks like that English teacher who are going to read everything that you do through a pretty narrow lens, whatever sort of maps onto their limited sense of what a Black person is, let alone what a Black artist is. That audience has to be in mind. You got to figure out some ways to subvert their expectations, to draw them in and help them reimagine what you're doing. And then at the same time, you can't be so aware of that audience that you allow your own spectrum of possibility to become as narrow as theirs. And it's a balancing act. I don't set that out like I think it's like an easy standard to live up to, but I do think it's worth striving for.
There's a part of the book when I read the book, and it troubled me until I just read that Paul Beatty quote, that there's something really white boy shuffle without some of the, parental drama that's in White Boy Shuffle. But the narrator of White Boy Shuffle, there's something that in your voice that reminds me of that. And so I was just curious to find what kind of text were you reading or listening to or watching that became kind of additional inspiration, for telling this story?
Man, it's a great question. I guess I should say, I was working on this book while I was Paul Beatty's student, which I think is not.
Oh, wow. So you're being taught by Gunnar Kaufman. I got you.
Yeah, more or less, right? I mean, a fun sort of lineage that's happening, I think, is when I met Paul Beatty as a student. I mean, I was familiar with him as a writer, obviously years before, but one of the things I wanted to talk to him about was being a student of Allen Ginsberg. I was a really big fan of Allen Ginsberg. He figures in the book a little bit. The Beat Generation were sort of a baseline influence. And I was aware that Allen Ginsberg taught at Brooklyn College at the same time that Paul Beatty was a student there. And so, we had lots of stuff to talk about in office hours, but the thing I really wanted to corner him about was what it was like being that dude's pupil. And he had a few different stories about it, but one of the stories that really stuck with me was Ginsberg critiquing one of Beatty's poems because it had these like overt references to Blackness. And Ginsberg's position was like, if you go down this I'm Black and the speaker in this poem is Black road, you're taking everybody who's not Black out of the poem. There's going to be no universality to what you're doing. And so I'm sitting there hearing this. I'm at this point 28 in my second year of grad school. And I'm just thinking about, man, this white writer who I really looked up to, but never had like a personal relationship with, was Paul's actual physical, in-person mentor. And he had this like very regressive, in my view, painfully disappointing attitude about Black art and about a genius like Paul Beatty. And now I get the opportunity to be Paul's student. And one day I'm probably going to have a student who was like Hey, you studied with Paul Beatty. What was that like? And that situation, I think, influenced a lot of how I thought about what I was doing in Boys in the Void. My awareness of this writer I looked up to having essentially an educational experience akin to the ones I'm writing about, and maybe those experiences influencing the way he kind of conducted his own work and created his own voice.
Let's talk about the punk music piece, both the actual technical aspects of being a musician and a songwriter, but that experience that you write about, sending in this idea of what your music was to the Urban Dictionary, right? And their response was like, not only don't we know what to do with this, we don't really think that you're somebody who's actually real. And so there are a lot of these moments throughout the book where you really talk about the illegibility of who you are, who your brother is. And one of those opportunities, obviously, is to show up as the Black kid who's into punk. So talk about how you travel to that space, right? Because there's a way in which the way we've essentialized young Black identity, particularly for someone who's your age, right? Though it's a little bit on the cusp, is you obviously must listen to hip hop. Right. And so what in your framework takes you to punk music and find your comfort zone. And in fact, the language in which you would talk to your brother throughout this book would be, this framework of punk music and punk music references.
Yeah. Well, the hip hop thing is interesting. When I was, in middle school or so, I was really fascinated with hip hop. And at some point, I did notice some of the overlap between hip hop attitude as a comportment, as something that's bigger than just what you listen to or even what you wear, but a way of walking and talking, and punk rock attitude. And I think the sort of awareness that this spirit could sort of translate not only across genre lines, but across these ideas about racial stereotypes was kind of a revelation to me. I should say, however, that before I ever thought critically about what punk meant, I was just really attracted to how it sounded. I heard like a generation of people, right? I heard Green Day's major label debut, Dookie, on the radio when I was probably 7 years old. I didn't know what a Marshall half-stack was. I didn't know what a Gibson Les Paul was, but I just heard that sound and I was like, whatever that is, I'm that.
Yeah.
And then years later, like I said, when I was kind of going through this, I ended up writing this. I wrote a paper, did a 3D exhibit on the history of hip hop in 7th grade for a National History Day competition. And I was so excited about it. And I thought I had a genuine chance. This was like 1998. So hip hop was barely recognized as like a coherent, like not something that people who weren't gangbangers like knew about. And I really think the response that my teachers and the judges of the National History Day competition had to this 12-year-old Black kid writing expansively about hip hop actually consolidated my punk bona fides. But yeah, once I realized that attitude, that sense of having a kind of stylized disaffection, an oppositional relationship to the dominant culture, that not only came from Public Enemy and Black Star and the whole Ruckus Records crew, but was also something that Green Day and The Clash and Ramones and Anti-Flag and all these other amazing bands were resonant with too. That just seemed like a really intuitive place for me, even though everyone I met was persuaded I had like been given the wrong directions, had taken a wrong turn at Albuquerque.
We're recording this conversation on what is the first day of Black History Month. And Black History Month is a weird thing these days, at least as I experience it. There was a time really up until 5 years ago, like I couldn't sleep the night before. Right, because the next day was like Black History Month. This morning, I get an email from Starbucks telling me they're celebrating Black History, but it's like, and why should I care about this? But I often think about Black History Month in my own framing as that moment where I come into a certain kind of consciousness, because suddenly there's stuff packaged for me that I wasn't aware of. You obviously grew up in a different kind of framework, right? I could have literally, I could see stacks of books all over your home that you could just pull and sit down and read, right? Again, the references that your little brother makes in some of his papers, right? It's like,
Yeah.
Really, he's reading Hegel. Really, it's like, I mean, but what was Black History Month like for you growing up, right? And what's your relationship with it now?
Well, I know you're not asking about Kwanzaa, but I can't help but link.
No, yeah, I got you. That's fine.
Black History Month with Kwanzaa, and I would say that both of those, especially in my early education, as I write about in the book, I went to a private school kind of on the other side of town from where I was actually from, because my parents determined that was the best move, like a lot of,
Understood.
And while I was there, I was so often called upon to be the token, the representative of whatever Kwanzaa was, of whatever Black History.
The Black History Month exhibit. No, I get it.
Yeah. And, I'm not proud of this. It's unfortunate, but I think both December and February began to feel to me like the moment when the sea that I was swimming in 365, 7 days a week, was like open for adult swim or something, right? Like the place I'm in socially and intellectually, and that I frankly almost would forget to name as a thing, the way a fish would forget to name water. Right. Is suddenly this like tourist attraction, and all these folks whose interest is very superficial and maybe even malintended are showing up in this water and saying, take me here, explain this to me, or worse than that, which is like, let me explain this to you. And so I wish that association wasn't as prominent, and that I could kind of have a less conflicted attitude about both Black History Month and Kwanzaa.
Yeah, I love that answer, actually. You publish Boyz in the Void in a moment where, publishers have always loved Black storytelling and Black memoirs, right? And it almost seems as though we're in a moment where the Black memoir is almost overdetermined in terms of nonfiction publications, right? And there have been some big memoirs. Some of these folks are my friends, so I won't throw anybody out there that way. But there seems to be a way in which, when you wrote this book, you were conscious of that and tried to write against it. And I mentioned this earlier, the kind of anti-memoir-ish aspect of it. Have you been surprised at all about the reception to the book, since it dropped last year?
I've had a couple conversations with friends about this, and I would say maybe not surprised, but sometimes I'm not sure I did as strong a job as I would have liked on a particular point, and that's this sense of, I always call it like the pluck over peril formula. I delineate the peril that my parents, and to a lesser degree myself, kind of dealt with en route to what some people would probably call like a relatively stable cosmopolitan middle class experience. And I wasn't trying to tell a story where structural obstacles are all surmountable, right, plucky enough. And I think what disappoints me sometimes is that the response to the book will sometimes center on this idea of, oh, I have these really audacious and hardworking and, I guess, sympathetic parents, and their sort of middle class values prevailed over all the obstacles they had. And I think one thing that troubles me about that is part of the point of the story is actually that a lot of the folks we envision as only belonging to the upwardly mobile classes are confined to, what we might call theaters of inner city warfare indefinitely. You know what I mean? Like when people encounter me in the world, this will probably feel a little bit like a detour, but it's relevant. I was teaching this class it was an upward bound program that was housed at Columbia University. It was kids who were, I think, between like 11 and 13.
Yeah.
And to qualify for the program, you had to be both, economically disadvantaged, whatever metric they used, and you had to demonstrate what we would call extraordinary academic ability.
Yeah.
So smart, poor kids, I think you know some.
Yeah.
I was one at one point. And of course, I'm co-teaching this class with a white woman from my MFA cohort who, went to Harvard for undergrad and is at Columbia for her MFA. And she's diagramming some sentences on the board, and the students are picking it up. They're not familiar with it, but they're picking it up. And she says to me, like, I can't believe these kids are this far along in their education. They've never had a diagram sentence. Explain to them. And I was like, well, public education can be like that, especially where there's high concentrations of Black kids and poor kids. And she's like, how do you know that? And I was like, well, I mean, I came from public schools. Like, I have a sense of it. And she was like, you went to a public high school? She said it in exactly that tone. And I was like, yeah. And she said, then how are you smart?
Yeah.
And that story, right, that outlook, and like I said, this is a person with an incredible academic pedigree. If someone who was that educated can hold that sort of reduced an understanding of what kinds of people exist and where at the various strata of society, then what hope is there for the average person? But I think part of the project of Boyz in the Void is to at least pick at that a little bit, if not reduce it to rubble, at least like rip a couple bricks down.
Did you show your brother the book as you were working on it, or as a final product? What was his reaction to the book?
Yeah, we had an ongoing dialogue about it. Sometimes I would say, well, this is what I'm working on right now, but I need you to say some more relevant stuff. And I would start asking him questions to turn on a tape recorder. Yeah. But in terms of once he actually read the ARC of the book, and he appeared at the book launch and everything. We had a public conversation. He said that one of the things he appreciated about the book was this sense that he was always aware of this family history that influenced his upbringing, but no one ever apprised him of the specific events that transpired. He kind of felt like a lot of things fell into place once he read the book. But the thing that surprised him most is that he felt like, even though this was written to him specifically, he felt like readers of a lot of different walks of life could take really significant lessons from it. And he kind of thought something built around our maybe highly particular rapport would not have as much broadband pertinence as he said it did. So that was flattering. I appreciated that.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because as you describe the family dynamics, the two of you are the 2 and the 5, right? The second oldest and the youngest, and what 15 years separation between you, and we wouldn't necessarily think of that as the natural interlocutors, right? In the context of a family. So, what do you attribute that dynamic to? I mean, because part of it is that you very actively and intentionally connected with your younger brother, right? There are things that he experienced that you also experienced, and so it was your instinct, right? To make those kind of connections. But what do you think was really about the dynamic of that the two of you would be, the primary interlocutors within the family space?
Well, I think it's probably the case that the 5 of us are closer than siblings tend to be a lot of the time, especially siblings with that huge a gap. I think I really chose to address the book to Jossie rather than any of my other 3 siblings, not because they wouldn't have made equally fascinating interlocutors, but because I thought it would really challenge me and produce some interesting discursive angles to specifically write to someone who was a generation apart. And I was also aware that Jossie's roughly the age of a lot of my students, and punk, and obviously in the world more broadly, intergenerational tensions are this major flash. And I wanted to kind of get the jump on that stuff and kind of make a bid for intergenerational exchange that had a more permissive contract to it. You know, I'm okay with some intergenerational tension. I want to have a back and forth, but I don't want to have a sort of paternalistic back and forth where I'm like, oh, millennials have it right and Zoomers don't. I want to learn from him. I want him to learn from me. And we have that kind of relationship. So I thought maybe I can make it into a blueprint for other sorts of intergenerational exchange.
What's next for you?
More writing, more teaching, more rocking. I'm pretty close to completing the book proposal for my next project. I've been kicking around ideas for a while. I feel very aware of the ways that we might all be sort of atrophying in terms of our social skills. 2 years of indoor living, and even now, right, there's kind of like this oscillation between, oh, everything's fine, and like, wait, actually go back on Zoom, social distance. I think it's hard to tabulate all the ways that that's affecting us. So what I found myself writing about is just patterns in socialization and maybe, you know, what kinds of socialization we should aspire to and work towards, given the attrition that's going on to our, you know, interpersonal muscles.
Thank you for joining us today, G'Ra. You are the first guest in our 12 years of Left the Block, in which both the parents of a guest and the parents were featured on the show. Yeah, I want to say your parents came on together back in season 5 or season 6 of Left the Block.
That's amazing.
So it's an honor to have you. As you know, I love the book. G'Ra Asim, who's the author of Boyz in the Void, a mixtape to my brother. He is an assistant professor of creative writing at Wash U in St. Louis. Of Boyz in the Void, Kimberly Crenshaw writes, Boyz in the Void is a spellbinding odyssey and a magnificent debut for an exciting young author and thinker. It was a pleasure to talk with you. I hope we get many more opportunities.
Hope so too. Thanks a lot for having me, Mark.
You're welcome.
A great honor.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.